It is really when we start to look at the aspects that we begin to really bring a lot of colour and shade and nuance to understanding what someone's challenges are, what their gifts are, and from the esoteric standpoint, what the karmic challenges and limitations that need to be overcome when we consider the personality and its tendency to inhibit the soul force when we start working with an esoteric interpretation of the horoscope. So today I'm going to endeavour to start bringing a bit of clarity on how we work with aspects from the esoteric standpoint in comparison to the exoteric or personality-centered chart alone. So keep watching. Superimposition is a key word when we start working with esoteric astrology, because we are essentially working with two different charts. We're working with the soul-centered chart, looking at the planets and their ray forces, the esoteric planetary rulers, and we're considering what information that is giving to us relative to the exoteric chart. That is the orthodox rulers, the typical interpretations of the planets, etc. When we're working with someone who has soul contact, then we're starting to see some of those esoteric forces come into the picture. And there'll be varying degrees of how synthetic or how connected and harmonized the soul-centered chart with the personality chart is. Or there will be some parts that are able to come through and express which planets are able to be seen, what qualities are coming through versus in what ways are the personality influences kind of corrupting or inhibiting, preventing the soul force from coming through. So this is where we start to play with all the aspects, and this starts to give a lot more information as to what's really going on there with the varying degrees of relationships. So let's start with an esoteric approach, and once we get some of the core principles, then we can look at how we would compare that with an exoteric delineation, or how we might need to shift an exoteric perspective to come into alignment with an esoteric perspective and all of this. So main point number one when working with aspects: hard aspects, squares, oppositions, inconjunctions, sometimes conjunctions depending on the nature of the planet. These are going to reveal karmic tensions that need to be overcome by the personality in order to release the soul force. When that tension is overcome, essentially what we will see is basically the square or the hard aspect will become irrelevant, or it'll really only depict a past situation about a chart. So yes, there is actually capacity to fully overcome some of the tensions that are brought to our attention through the aspects in the chart. Hard aspects between two planets, non-sacred and sacred of the same ray, are going to be like asterisks, because those are going to really show dynamic tensions between the soul and the personality force. And in such a hard aspect, let's say we've got a square between Sun and Jupiter, second ray, or Mars, Neptune, sixth ray, Moon, Mercury, fourth ray. The non-sacred planet in that situation has to bend to whatever the sacred planet is trying to do. And that is also generally true whenever we have a hard aspect between a sacred and a non-sacred planet, even if they are of different rays, but we're always going to be trying to orient to the sacred planet because, as we discussed in the planets videos, sacred versus non-sacred, these are just, the sacred planets are describing subjective interior forces, and when we're working with the soul, the deeper spiritual essence of those sacred planets are really going to start to emerge, as opposed to, let's say, you've got someone purely expressing exoterically, but they're still a Jupiterian, but that would just be the exoteric filter of Jupiter as it comes through the three worlds, so it'd just be buoyant, optimistic, fun, etc. So sacred planets need to take the reins, essentially, whenever we've got a difficult relationship being revealed through the aspects in the chart. The other major thing you want to look to is the house rulers from the orthodox and the esoteric standpoint, including and maybe most especially the ascendant and the rising sign. So let's say you've got Pisces rising, you're looking to the exoteric ruler Jupiter versus Pluto. And let's say you have a square between Jupiter and Pluto. Okay, then we're going to see that there is a very specific tension between the personality and the soul life that's trying to be overcome. Assuming that you're working with someone that has this question about the soul, they've started to respond to impressions from the soul in that way. And following that example, okay, Risa, you just said that the sacred planet needs to overcome the non-sacred planet, but what about in such an example where you have Pisces as the rising, because Pluto is a non-sacred planet and Jupiter is the sacred planet? Oh, so this is where we have to get nuanced, because while Pluto is a non-sacred planet, we have to consider how the non-sacred planets do become repurposed when working with the soul. So where there's an exception to that rule of sacred overcoming the non-sacred is when we have a situation like that where the two planets in question are the exoteric versus the esoteric ruler. In the case of Pisces rising, we have to look at the ways in which the Jupiter expression of Pisces is that exoteric expression, because it's not always a given that every sacred planet is only going to be expressing in a sacred way. That completely depends on how conscious the individual is and what are the energies pouring through. For Pisces, it's a little bit nebulous, because Jupiter can just generally show an urge towards love and care and that slightly Aquarian orientation that comes in through Jupiter when we start responding to the soul, of course, because Jupiter is the esoteric ruler of Aquarius, so wanting to share, wanting to love, wanting to bring things together. But Jupiter, in its lesser expression in its relationship to Pisces, is blind, undifferentiated immersion with experience, right? And that's a second ray shadow or delusion or undifferentiation like this. So yes, sacred planets need to be coming forward through in their sacred expression, but we have to bear in mind that sacred planets do have a filtered expression through the exoteric plane. And so that's where we really have to rely on our intuition and have enough of an awareness of the energy centers in ourselves and what the different octaves of these planets look like to be able to gauge, okay, here we've got a prominent sacred planet in the chart, but is it expressing in a sacred way? Because if the person is predominantly personality identified or at that beginning journey, then we would expect it to express more in an exoteric way. So it's a bit like I before E, except after C there are some basic rules, but then there are some of those ways in which we have to flip it on its head, like in the Jupiter-Pluto example with Pisces rising. Trines, sextiles, some positive conjunctions. These are a little bit more straightforward in terms of how we consider an exoteric versus an esoteric delineation. Keeping in mind that when we're talking about this superimposition, utilizing the different like the dual chart interpretations, the movement to the soul center chart is always going to be about this transference of energies or a reorientation that goes on. Okay, that's what living the soul is. That's the main thing, is that we're repolarizing into a different energy, and that's the way in which that energy is starting to permeate through and overcome some of the lesser forces in the chart. So in the case of trines and sextiles, we're really, for the most part, seeing a higher octave up. So let's say Venus trine Jupiter, that would be a super duper harmonic aspect, right? A really happy aspect. Jupiter and Venus typically are the most positive benefics in astrology. We've got Venus, the planet of beauty, love. We're staying in exoteric realm for the moment. desire, the finer things, the arts, and Jupiter, optimism, expansion, the yes man, principle of truth, starting to move into some of the esoteric movements there. So what would we say here? A really good relational person, someone who can connect with lots of different people, who has a genuine affection for other people. So just purely staying in the realm of exoteric astrology, we're looking at a really positive, benefic personality trait here. If we're looking at someone with that aspect who's got a lot of soul influence, then we're going to take the esoteric depictions, delineations of those planets. So now we have Jupiter, second ray, heart, the urge towards love, the urge towards synthesis, the urge towards living the spiritual life as that truth aspect of Jupiter, and the second ray rules the heart center. In trine with Venus, who is a fifth ray planet of concrete knowledge and science, and harmonizes the opposites upon the mental plane. So now we have an aspect that's revealing a really beautiful synthesis between heart and mind. And that is the greater dualities. That's part of that, the fusion that goes on when we're orienting towards the soul life. So let's say you have two different charts. One person's purely exoteric, one person's really starting to work with the solar energies. They could have this exact aspect, but they're going to have very different feelings, even though we can maybe both people will exhibit some of those exoteric qualities we just spoke about before, with these benefics being in happy relationship with each other. But the soul-centered person is going to really be expressing that higher turn. There's going to be a lot more consciousness, wisdom and knowledge. That's heart, second ray wisdom, Jupiter, and the knowledge that comes through the activation of the higher mind, the precision of knowledge, spiritual truth, the capacity for the communication of wisdom in a way that makes those relationships really clear and well comprehended and understood. All of these energies are starting to really come through with the trine. So if the person is working with the soul and there's an obvious presence of the solar energies starting to come through, trines, or these positive aspects, sextiles, are going to really be really easily switched up or utilized by the soul when the soul comes online. They also tend to depict qualities that we've earned from previous lifetimes. So for the soul-centered person with Jupiter trine Venus, this is something they have earned. This is a gift that they're coming in with. And so if there's an obvious point in the life where there's a turning over into that solar expression, we're just going to see the positive qualities that were already present with that trine, but they're going to really come forward in that higher octave way. So we still see a transference of energies, but the nature of that transference is going to be much more harmonious. There isn't a tension between the lesser and the higher self. However, there are some examples where this can be, again, another place where we can break the rules. Venus trine Neptune, for instance, that could be a really beautiful placement, but Neptune can also be one of quite a bit of glamour. So even though we would say from a personality standpoint that Venus trine Neptune is a positive aspect and brings a lot of emotional sensitivity or imagination and fantasy into the realm of relationship, we still have to consider how, again, these planets, especially the sacred planets, are filtered through the lower three worlds. And in the case of Neptune, we say it gets filtered through the moon as the lower three bodies and becomes the shadow aspect of Neptune. So we do have to bear in mind that for the most part, there's going to be a pretty straightforward transference of positive personality qualities to the soul qualities with trines and sextiles. But there are some situations, depending on the planets, such as Neptune. Neptune's kind of a tricky one because of how it can show up exoterically in its shadowy realm. That even a trine or a sextile may depict a delusion or a distortion or too optimistic. That's a bit more of a Jupiter square type of thing, but too emotionally because Neptune is 6th ray astral body. So something is a bit too stuck in the astral plane a little bit. So even with that principle, there are some exceptions there. But while it can seem complicated when we're first grasping these concepts or ideas, we bear in mind that when we're really working with the intuition, we're working with understanding the rays and really starting to sense the planets as they express through the esoteric realm and the exoteric realm. That's what's going to be the ABCs and the building blocks out of which you can start to really intuit, really genuinely intuit these nuances and these subtleties when it comes to aspects like we're talking about today. So a quick recap: negative and hard aspects, some conjunctions, karmic dynamics that need to be released and transformed to allow the soul energy to come through. And upon really overcoming that challenge, we would expect that that aspect would no longer be able to tell us something about the present situation for a more evolved person. It'll just be an indicator of a past challenge. So that's hard aspects. Positive aspects, trines, sextiles, for the most part, they just have a much more simple ease of transference into the soul-centered life when that reorientation happens, with the exception of some planets here like Neptune, where you just have to watch out for where there can be a bit too dreaminess, or there's some aspect of how that planet can still be filtering through its exoteric manner in that way. And the other piece for major aspects you want to look to, like asterisk points, are non-sacred versus sacred planets of the same ray. Super duper interesting potential clashes there, and that's going to really depict a battle between the selves. And then the orthodox and esoteric rulers, most especially of the rising sign, but certainly of any sign and whatever its house it's aspecting in the chart, you want to look to that. So Pisces at the midheaven, look to the Pluto and Jupiter relationship. Sagittarius on the 5th house, look to the Jupiter and the Earth relationship there. Superimposition, transference of energies, and knowing what the different octaves of the planets are. Those are your main focal points when we start to look at aspects in the esoteric horoscope. Let's play with a few different examples now and experiment with how we might delineate from different angles. So let's say we have Sun square Jupiter. Now, esoterically, that's kind of interesting because we've got two second ray planets there, the Sun being non-sacred, Jupiter being the sacred planet. Exoterically, we might say Jupiter, positivity, buoyancy, expansion, yes, optimism. In hard aspect to something about the identity, the core essence of the self, the ideas about oneself, one's abilities, one's natural radiance and shine. So we could see here someone who has too much of an optimistic attitude that's ungrounded with reality. Maybe that looking on the bright side in a kind of blind or denial kind of way, a lack of discernment and differentiation, like we talked about with Jupiter in the second ray before. We could also see someone who inflates their capacity, their identity, they think they know more than they actually do. They overestimate their abilities. So that would be Jupiter operating in its lesser exoteric way, as it expanding and in a blind, undifferentiated way. This is through the exoteric plane only, and that's it at this clash with the Sun as the identity. So that's kind of just keeping it at an exoteric level. How would we interpret this esoterically? So we take that factor into consideration because, of course, the exoteric chart is going to tell us about the personality. So this is why we need to cover our bases in terms of being fluent enough with exoteric astrology, because you still have a personality. You still have parts of your identity that are limited or being filtered through the lower three realms. So we take that, but we then bring the dimension of the sacred second ray here. So now we're saying Jupiter and the urge towards truth, the spiritual purpose, that which is, oh, my earring fell out. One sec. your spiritual purpose, the urge towards the love principle, orienting towards the spiritual life and the unfolding of love. Remember that Jupiter again is the esoteric ruler of Aquarius, so the urge towards service and of living the love principle, orienting towards the truth. The identity, the personality, the sun is not on board with that in some way. The desires of personality are still got more of a grip, or there's some kind of confusion between what the spiritual life is versus what the personality life is. There's a need to discern and differentiate. So yes, we still have the potential conflicts of that exoteric delineation there, but now we're seeing within the nature of that square, from an esoteric standpoint, Sun and Jupiter in this case, the tension between the higher and the lower self. Remember that that is a particular asterisk note when you've got two planets of the same ray in a clash. Whereas when we were playing with that exoteric delineation of this square, it's sort of an equal responsibility between exoteric Jupiter and exoteric Sun to come into more of a balanced relationship there. And generally speaking, as one of the main differences when we're approaching exoteric with esoteric, if we're working with exoteric, psychological, evolutionary kind of astrology, which is still very helpful, by the way, of course, because it's going to bring integration and synthesis to the personality, where there's sort of equal weight still to the different bodies, because again, they're both still expressing through the personality expression. They're both still expressing through the three realms. So that is again why this superimposition thing is so important, because we're going to be able to bring a lot more color. Or let's say if you're working with someone's chart and that exoteric delineation isn't really cutting it anymore, where the person is really starting to express this struggle between what the spiritual urge is calling for in their life versus what they thought they were meant to become as that core sun expression, as the core identity. When that really starts to become this point of crisis or tension, then we're seeing the esoteric influences come through. We're seeing the sacred urge of the second ray in this example with Jupiter start to imbue itself and put pressure on the ways in which the attitude of the sun as the core identity, the lower self, is wanting to fight against or is not really in alignment anymore with what this Jupiterian urge is starting to suggest or pull the person towards. We would see a similar flavor of challenge from the esoteric standpoint with an aspect like Mars and Neptune. That would be another asterisk square because, or hard aspect, because they are both sixth ray planets. In this case, the Mars would be acting more like the Sun in the previous example, where the Mars becomes, yes, exoterically Mars is action, sometimes sexuality, vitality, yes to all of that. But esoterically, it really becomes the embodiment of the personality, because what keeps the personality in its grips in terms of it being polarized away from the soul is the astral body. That's like the real tough one to overcome. So in that square or hard aspect, opposition, whatever, semi-square with the Mars and Neptune, that's going to be the personal desires versus it's very similar to the Jupiterian example, but more of the crisis of love or devotion, I guess, because it's sixth ray. So it's, yeah, I mean, second and sixth ray have a similar flavor, so maybe it wasn't the best example to use, but we're in deep now, so we'll continue with it. But that's the same sort of dynamic where we've got lesser desires, so you have to really go, what is this Mars? What is the lesser desires of my lower nature versus what is this mystical heart really pulling me towards? So that would be quite a dynamic tension to overcome, maybe even more so than the Sun Jupiter, because the sixth ray and that astral body problem and the transference that Neptune speaks to in terms of solar plexus to the heart, that's a very dynamic crisis point for anyone who's working on that process of repolarizing into the soul. Mars and Neptune as a conjunction, I would be more inclined to delineate that as a negative struggle, just because there's probably going to be a blind enmeshment between those different impulses. So you're going to have to differentiate it out, particularly in the case of Mars and Neptune, because it's a sacred and a non-sacred planet dynamic. So you have to go, okay, is this actually, like, which is which are the different motivating forces? What about non-sacred planets when they're in aspect to each other? How do we bring an esoteric interpretation of that? To do that, we would still look to the ray energies and consider the energy centers, and rather than with the non-sacred and a sacred planet describing something about a transference of energies or a shifting from one angle to the other, a tension between, certainly in the case of a hard aspect, but the tension between two non-sacred planets, let's say we've got a Mars and Moon hard aspect, that's going to be something that needs to be dissolved. So particularly with Mars and Moon, we've got past and astral. So there's a lot of automated patterning Moon around the astral body and the personal desires, Mars. And so that clash is going to really need to be broken open. It'll be difficult, and it will require the soul urge to really need to take the forefront, and that could be a utilization of the higher energies from other planets in the chart, but there won't necessarily be an obvious transference that is depicted or hinted at with the case, let's say, with a non-sacred planet aspecting a sacred planet. It's really going to be becoming very conscious of the limitations of that aspect and working to break free of that inhibition there that comes with the clash. And insofar as that a positive aspect, let's say Sun trine, Moon trine Mars, same thing that we spoke about before with trines. It'll be there'll be just an octave up of now the soul energy coming through that expression. So we'd say the devotion of the personality as it's being moved by the soul, which would be the highest expression of Mars, the single-pointed devotion to the soul purpose, is in a nice relationship with that which patterns the form. So that could actually be a potent aspect when we've got a really evolved person working through that aspect, because there's a kind of density of substance being worked with. We think about Cancer and Scorpio as the Moon and Mars rules, and then we take into account all the other rulerships that go on there. The Moon esoterically ruling Virgo, so patterning and bringing all the forms together. Mars esoterically, well, at its hierarchical level, rules Sagittarius, so that's the single point and focus again. But I would still look at even a positive aspect between Moon and Mars, potentially, depending on what else is going on in the chart, as even in a trine, as an inhibition or a potential bondage to materiality still, if Moon and Mars are both expressing exoterically, because they are non-sacred planets and they do often show the ways in which the form is like we're stuck in the past, Moon, and attached to the past and the desires of the lower self, Mars. So even in a trine, there might still demonstrate a tendency for like a drive towards comfort or personal satiation in some way. So even though there are these basic principles and rules that we can point to, that let's say all positive aspects, trines will just be easy transference, there are always exceptions to that rule based on what we know about the planets and the energy centers they rule and the signs that they rule. So again, it's very nuanced and complex, but if you really get your foundations right, you can just start to feel and intuit much more effectively, okay, I know what the limitations of, in this case, Mars and Moon are, and really starting to tease out the dynamic here. But it always comes back to what, in terms of like really simplifying it as a fundamental principle, where is the urge towards love? What needs to be overcome in the name of serving love in the most dynamic and potent way? And I want to really quickly come back to the Mars-Neptune example, because this is actually a square that I have. When I had my big crisis of reorientation, Neptune was at the midheaven at the time, my midheaven in Pisces, and this is 7 years ago now, that the reality of the square between Neptune and Mars in my chart came up really strong. I could really feel that dweller on the threshold versus the mystical orientation of the heart like come into this clash, and there really was this almost that the solar angel overcoming the dweller on the threshold. It was a very potent metaphysical experience. But even though I had that experience and that essentially that crisis was overcome, let's say, I still struggle with Neptune and Mars square from the personality standpoint, or I have. It's starting to fade out now, but that still continued as an exoteric struggle for quite some time. So, and that's because we still have personalities and we still have to integrate the personalities. So it's not just that the soul comes online and therefore everything is interpreted through a soul-centered point of view. No, because we still have the form, we still have to balance certain psychic energies, the balancing of the astral plane, like all of these factors still play out exoterically. So for Mars, Neptune, an exoteric delineation of a hard aspect between those two is my capacity for action is thwarted by confusion, delusion. My vitality and creative drive is confused and diffused by Neptunian fantasy or uncertainty. So uncertainty around action has been a big theme for me, and that's continued even though I've known fundamentally, okay, I'm working with the soul and it's going in this direction. There's still been these psychic distortions within the personality expression of that. So this is why we still need to be adept with working with the chart exoterically, even if we are responding to solar forces, because we still have personalities. We still have the lunar problem of the lower three realms to bring into synthesis. We still need to have become scorpionically in tune with our own astral problem and what needs to be overcome and brought into a harmony. So exoteric astrology, certainly personality, rather psychological, archetypal, evolutionary astrology, they do a really great job at that, at really looking at how we can evolve the psychological struggles between those patterns. But I would say if we are working with the soul, our capacity to integrate the challenges of the personality becomes that much, I don't know about easier, but certainly we can do it a lot faster, I think, or the pressure to integrate and become more unified is that much more important, because now we're being motivated by a deeper, much more potent spiritual force that really is placing that urgency on the personality to get its shit together, essentially. So yeah, personality astrology is still important for that reason, and we still need to always be working at that level of superimposition, looking at the different charts. And then of course, when we're talking about a really advanced initiate beyond level, then we're really seeing at that point the personality influences will get to a stage where they can really fade out, and we're only seeing influences of the zodiacal signs and their energies and the planetary forces, especially the sacred planets, really starting to dominate and really sing in the chart. I hope you could follow along with this complicated video today. Of course, aspects are a huge topic and it gets a lot more nuanced and challenging, and we're considering a whole bunch more different factors when we're looking at the horoscope, which would be the case anyway in exoteric astrology, and now we're bringing in a second dimension with the esoteric astrology as well. So I hope you've been able to grasp a little bit of what I've been speaking about today, and it gives you a few tips and tricks and tools for looking at your own chart and contemplating it in relationship to the soul.